The gunmen came at midnight.
I see them. What do they
Caleb
want?
Mason heard them before he saw them. Enough. The sound carried across the flatlands the way sound always did in Texas, ahead of itself, arriving before the source, a warning the land gave to those who knew how to listen. Hoofbeats,
This earth is
more
dry
than
as
one
dust.
horse,
We have
moving
to keep
fast
moving.
and deliberate from the
I know.
south.
This section
He was
is wrong.
already
We must
standing on
change
the
it.
crest
How?
of
We
the
don't have time.
unfinished
We'll find a
dam
way.
when the
Look here.
first
All right,
torch
show me.
appeared on the ridge.
Best get moving.
Then
Sun's high.
another.
Aye. The settlement's a day's
Then
ride.
3
Let's ride.
more. The structure beneath his boots was still damp in places where the mortar had not fully cured. He could feel it through the leather soles. 7 weeks of labor, hauled stone by stone from the hillside, fitted by hand in the Texas heat until his palms bled and his back stopped hurting only because it had gone numb. 7 weeks of building something in a valley where everything else was dying. He raised the rifle, settled it against his shoulder, looked down the sight at the line of riders spreading out along the southern bank. The narrator's voice came low and unhurried, the way a woman speaks when she is telling you something true. He knew this night would come. What he did not know, standing there in the dark with the smell of damp earth and gunpowder in the air, was that he would not be standing there alone. That part of the story began 7 weeks earlier, on a train platform, with a woman nobody came for. The platform at Redemption sat at the edge of town like an afterthought, weathered boards stretching into the fading September light, a structure built more for function than comfort. There was a single bench against the station wall, a water barrel that had gone dry sometime in July, a hand-painted sign that read, Redemption, Texas, though the second E had faded so badly it might have said anything at all. Caleb Mason rode in from the west with dust on his coat and a list of supplies in his shirt pocket. Feed, if the merchant still had any, fencing wire, coffee, if he could afford it. Simple things. The kind of errand that did not require thinking, which was exactly what he needed these days. He had not been sleeping well. He had not been sleeping well for 2 years. He tied his horse at the rail in front of Morrison's and went inside to place his order. He came back out 20 minutes later to find the afternoon had deepened into something almost tolerable and the supply wagon was running behind schedule. He leaned against the post, pulled his hat low, and waited. That was when he saw her. She was sitting at the far end of the platform with a trunk at her feet and her hands folded in her lap. Her traveling dress was gray, the kind of gray that had once been some other color before too many washings had softened it down to nothing. Her dark hair was pinned up, but the wind off the plains kept pulling pieces loose, and she did not seem to notice or did not seem to care. She was very still. The kind of stillness that does not come from peace, but from a person who has gone very quiet inside themselves to survive something. Caleb looked away. Not his business. He had enough of his own problems without borrowing someone else's. The minutes moved slowly. The sun moved faster. He looked back once and she had not moved. Looked away again. Looked back a second time and something shifted in his chest, the specific discomfort of recognizing another person's pain in a man who has learned to look away from suffering and finds he cannot, this once, manage it. He walked over. His spurs made a small sound against the boards with each step. He stopped a respectful distance away and cleared his throat. She looked up. Her eyes were dark, and there was a steadiness in them that surprised him. Not the bright watchfulness of someone waiting for good news. The steadiness of someone who had already received the bad kind and had decided to remain upright anyway. He said, "The train is running late tonight." She said, "I know. The station master told me." There will not be another eastbound until Tuesday. That is 5 days from now. Yes. He studied her for a moment. You planning to sit here until Tuesday? A shadow of something moved across her face, something that was not quite a smile but had once known what smiling felt like. She said, I have not decided yet. He should have left it there. He should have tipped his hat and gone back to wait for his supplies and ridden home and not thought twice about a woman alone on a platform in a town that was slowly dying of thirst. He had done enough for strangers. There had been a time when he fixed fences for his neighbors without being asked, when he brought food to families hit hard by sickness, when Ruth would scold him gently for giving away things they could barely spare themselves. That version of him felt like a story someone had told him about another man. But he didn't leave. He said, My name is Caleb Mason. I have a ranch about 2 hours west. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Nora Elliot. He said, Where were you headed, Miss Elliot? She looked out at the tracks, which were empty in both directions. She said, Nowhere, apparently. I was supposed to meet someone here. A man I had been corresponding with for 6 months. He owned a dry goods operation in town. He said he needed a wife, someone educated, someone who could help with accounts and correspondence. I thought it seemed practical. She stopped. Then she said, He did not come. Caleb understood immediately. Men in the territories writing to Eastern women with careful letters full of promise and good handwriting. Sometimes it worked. Often it did not. He said, How long have you been waiting? She said, 3 days. He said, Do you have money for a hotel? She looked at him for a long moment, and in that look was the whole story. The trunk at her feet held everything she owned. The dress she wore had been mended twice at the left cuff. She had come west on the faith of letters written by a man she had never met, and arrived to find an empty platform and a station master who could only shrug. She said, I will manage. They both knew that was not true. Caleb turned away. He walked back toward his horse. He told himself this was the right decision. He had 40 head of cattle that were starving in a pasture without grass, a well that was dropping a foot a week, a ranch that was being slowly erased by a drought that showed no interest in ending. He was not in a position to take on someone else's trouble. He got almost to his horse before the memory hit him. Not a thought. A memory. Something physical. Ruth sitting on the porch in the dark the night before he left for the cattle drive. The way she had looked at him, not with worry. She had never been a worrying kind of woman, but with that particular expression she had when she wanted to remember something. The way she said, Come home, Caleb. That was all. Just come home. He had been away 3 weeks. When he came back, the graves were already dug. He stood beside his horse with one hand on the saddle and did not move for a long moment. Then he turned around. He said, Can you cook? Can you mend? Can you do the work a ranch requires? She stood up slowly, and he noticed that she was taller than he had expected, and that her shoulders were straight in a way that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with not letting things beat her down, even when they were trying very hard. She said, I was raised on a farm until I was 16. I have been working as a governess in Philadelphia for the past 12 years. I know how to work, Mr. Mason. He said, I have a roof, 3 meals a day, your own room with a lock on the door. You work for your keep, nothing more, nothing less. When the Tuesday train comes, you are free to go. No expectations, no obligations beyond honest labor. That is what I am offering. She stared at him as though he had offered her the moon, and she was not sure she trusted the offer. She said, You do not know me. He said, No, ma'am, I do not. But I know what it looks like when a person has nowhere left to go. And I know what it costs a person to sit still and wait for something that is not coming. He looked out at the empty platform, then back at her. Out here, we help each other, or we all go under. That is just how it is. A long pause. The wind moved through the dry grass beyond the tracks, making a sound like paper. She asked, "What happened to your wife?" He said, "Fever, 2 years ago. Her and our daughter both." Something crossed her face. Not pity. Something more careful than pity. She said, "I am sorry." He nodded. She said, "I accept your offer, Mr. Mason. Thank you." He picked up her trunk. It was heavier than it looked, full of books by the feel of it. He balanced it across the back of his saddle and spent a few minutes with the rope, making sure it would hold. Then he mounted and reached down for her. She took his hand. Her grip was firm, the palms rough in a way that told him she was not lying about knowing how to work. She swung up behind him with more ease than most women would have managed, and after a brief pause, her arms came around his waist and settled there with the careful formality of a stranger. "Ready?" he asked. "As I will ever be," she said. He turned his horse west, and they rode out of Redemption into a darkening sky, the color of embers. They did not talk much on the ride. The plains spread around them in every direction, vast and quiet, and broken only by the sound of Cisco's steady hoofbeats and the dry whisper of the wind. The last light was draining out of the western sky, and the first stars were appearing, and Caleb was aware of the warmth of another person behind him in a way he had not been aware of anything in a very long time. He had not been this close to another human being since the day he said goodbye to the men who helped him dig the graves. She asked, "How bad is the drought?" He said, "Bad. No rain since February. The creek through the north section has been dry since April. Wells are dropping all across the valley. I have lost half my herd already. Sold off cheap before they starved or just let them go to thirst." She said, "Is there no other water source?" He said, "There was a creek. Good one, used to run all spring and into summer. Came down out of the hills during snowmelt. This year, there was not enough snow to matter, and what there was evaporated before it reached the valley floor." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "What will you do if it does not rain?" He said the same thing he said to himself every morning when he walked out and looked at the sky and saw nothing but blue. "Keep going until I can't anymore. That is all any of us can do." She said, "That is very bleak, Mr. Mason." He said, "That is Texas, Miss Elliot." She fell quiet again, and the silence that came after was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had both run out of things to pretend. The ranch appeared gradually in the last of the twilight, low shapes against the flat horizon. The main house was a solid structure, stone foundation, wood frame, a porch wrapping around two sides. His father had built it 30 years ago when the valley was green and full of promise. His father had been a man who believed in permanence. He had built things to last. Caleb helped Nora down from the saddle and stood for a moment with her in the yard while she looked around at what she had agreed to. The yard was swept clean. The fences were in repair, but the flowers along the porch were long gone, and the window boxes Ruth had planted with herbs were empty. And there was a quality to the place that was hard to name exactly, the quality of a home where someone had stopped caring about the small, beautiful things. He said, "Welcome to Mason Ranch. I know it is not much." She said, "It is fine. Thank you for bringing me here." He carried her trunk up the porch steps and pushed open the front door. Inside was clean and spare. A table, 4 chairs, a fireplace with a good stone mantel. The floors were swept. He lit the lamp on the table, and the warm light pushed out the dark. And for a moment, the main room looked almost like it had once looked, like a place where people lived rather than just endured. "Kitchen is through there," he said. "Bedroom's upstairs. You will take the one on the left." He carried her trunk up the narrow staircase and set it down beside the bed in the small room at the top. He had not opened this door in 8 months. The room was clean, but it had the stillness of a space that had been holding its breath. He turned to leave and found her standing in the doorway, the lamp throwing shadows across her face. She looked at him. She looked at the room. Then she crossed to the shelf beside the small window and stopped. On the shelf, partially hidden behind a fold of curtain, was a pair of shoes. They were very small, dark brown leather, worn soft at the toes. The kind of shoes a child grows out of before they wear out, because children always grow faster than shoes can follow. Caleb moved across the room in 2 steps and took them from the shelf. He did not say anything. He did not explain. He turned to the wardrobe and opened it and set the shoes inside on the bottom shelf and closed the door again. His back was to her the whole time. She said nothing. He said, "Good night, Miss Elliot." She said, "Good night, Mr. Mason." He went downstairs. He went outside. He stood in the dark yard for a long time, looking at the stars and listening to the vast and breathing silence of the Texas night. Inside, the lamp in the kitchen window came on. He heard the sound of a drawer being opened, the quiet sounds of a person moving through an unfamiliar space, cautious and careful. He had put the envelope there 3 months after Ruth died, when he could no longer stand having it in the bedroom, but could not bring himself to throw it away. The envelope with Ruth's handwriting on the front, the one she had pressed into the hands of her sister and said, "Only give this to him if I do not come through." The one her sister had delivered to him at the graveside, and that he had held for 2 years without opening. He had not been ready. He still was not ready. When he finally went back inside and walked through the kitchen to the stairs, the envelope was back where he had left it, undisturbed, resting against the side of the drawer exactly as he had placed it. Whatever she had seen, she had chosen to leave it alone. He went upstairs to his room and lay down on his bed in the dark and looked at the ceiling, and somewhere in the house he could hear the faint sound of pages turning, the quiet companionship of someone reading in the room across the hall, and the silence that had been pressing against him for 2 years was, for the first time, something other than empty. Morning came early. Caleb woke before dawn, as he always did, and came downstairs to find the kitchen already lit, the stove burning, and Nora Elliot standing at the counter with her sleeves rolled up measuring coffee into the pot. She had tied her hair back. She was wearing a plain work dress, darker than the gray traveling dress, and she had found the apron hanging on the peg by the back door and put it on without being told. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and coffee and the memory of mornings when this room had been full of life. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she noticed him. She said, "I hope you do not mind. I could not sleep past 4. Sitting still makes me think too much." He said, "I know the feeling." She turned and handed him a cup. Her eyes were clear and direct in the early morning light, the look of someone who notices things other people overlook and files them away without comment. He took the coffee. They stood on opposite sides of the kitchen in a silence that was surprisingly easy to inhabit. Then he said, "Today I will show you what needs doing." She said, "I would like that." They went out into the gray pre-dawn, and he showed her the well, which was low, and the barn, which needed mucking, and the cattle that were thin but still standing, and the fence line along the southern pasture where 3 posts had gone soft in the ground. She did not flinch at any of it. She walked beside him and listened and asked practical questions in a quiet voice, and did not pretend the situation was better than it was. When he showed her where the creek had run, she crouched down in the dry bed and picked up a handful of the soil there and let it run through her fingers. She said, "This is good earth, dark. You can see where the water table is." She pointed to a faint line of discoloration along the lower bank. "It is low, but it is not gone. If you could capture water here when it does come, hold it instead of letting it run off and evaporate." He said, "A dam." She said, "Something like a dam, yes." She stood up and brushed her palms on her apron. "I would need to look at the topography, the hills to the north, where the runoff would naturally channel. But if the geometry is right, and if the soil composition here is what I think it is." He said, "Where did you learn to think like that?" She looked at the dry creek bed for a moment before answering. "My father," she said. "He was a civil engineer. He came over from England when he was 22 and spent his life building things in Pennsylvania. He died when I was 16, but he spent those 16 years teaching me to look at the land and understand what it wanted to do." A pause. She said, "He said water always wants to go somewhere useful. You just have to help it." Caleb looked at the dry creek, at the pale scar in the earth where water had run for 100 years before this drought had erased it. He thought about what it would take to build something here. The labor, the materials, the time, the chance that none of it would matter if the rains never came. He thought about the well dropping a foot a week and his remaining cattle and the banknote coming due in 6 months. He looked at the woman standing beside him in the dry creek bed with her sleeves rolled up and her father's words in her mouth, and something that was not quite hope, but was shaped like hope, beginning to move through him, slow and cautious and fragile as anything that has been absent for a long time. He said, "Come on, we have work to do." She fell into step beside him, and they walked back toward the ranch in the early morning light, 2 people still strangers to each other, carrying between them, without knowing it yet, the first weight of something that might someday become a future. The first week passed the way hard weeks do, not slowly, not quickly, but with a weight that required everything you have and gave back only exhaustion and the knowledge that you are still standing. Nora Elliot did not ask for special treatment, and Caleb Mason did not offer any. That suited them both. She was up before him each morning, which he discovered on the second day and accepted without comment. By the time he came downstairs, the stove was burning and the coffee was made, and she was usually already out at the barn or moving through some task she had identified on her own without being told. He had left her a list the first morning, a habit from working alone, things that needed doing written out in his careful handwriting. She had completed everything on the list by noon, and started on 3 additional things he had not thought to mention. He did not tell her the list was impressive. He told her the south fence needed another post replaced before it fell entirely. She said, "I already saw that. I was going to get to it this afternoon." He said, "All right." That was the shape of their days. Work divided and shared without ceremony. Meals eaten at the kitchen table with more quiet than conversation. Evenings on the porch, when the heat finally broke enough to make sitting outside bearable. They were careful with each other, the way people are careful when they are still learning the edges of someone new and do not want to cause accidental harm. He noticed things about her, the way you notice what is new in a space you have memorized through long familiarity. The way she tested a fence post with both hands before deciding whether it needed replacing or just resetting. The way she moved through the barn with the quiet authority of someone who had grown up around animals. The way she read in the evenings with the focused stillness of a person who actually wants to know what is on the page. On the fourth evening, he asked what she was reading. She turned the cover toward him. It was a book on hydraulic engineering, well used, the spine cracked in multiple places. He said, "You carried that all the way from Philadelphia." She said, "I carried 12 books from Philadelphia. This is the most practical one." He almost smiled. He did not quite get there, but it was closer than he had come in some time. On the 8th day, Nora put a folded piece of paper on the kitchen table beside his coffee cup before he came down. He unfolded it over breakfast. It was a hand-drawn diagram, careful lines, precise measurements, notes written small in the margins in her steady handwriting. She had sketched the northern section of the property from memory, the curve of the dry creek bed, the rise of the hills to the northeast, the narrows where the banks came close together and the bedrock showed through at the surface. At the narrowest point, she had drawn the outline of a dam. Beside it, a rough calculation of water volume. How much a structure of that size could hold. How many weeks that volume would sustain a herd of 40 head. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. She sat across from him with her coffee and waited. He said, "You did this from memory." She said, "I walked the creek bed 3 times this week while you were working the south pasture. I wanted to understand the geometry before I said anything." He said, "How long have you been thinking about this?" She said, "Since the first morning you showed me where the creek had been." He set the paper down. He picked it up again. He looked at the numbers in the margin, the calculations for volume and flow rate and evaporation loss, the kind of numbers that came from someone who understood what they were doing. He said, "Where exactly would you position the foundation?" She stood up and came around the table and leaned over the diagram with her finger moving along the creek bed line. "Here," she said, "where the banks narrow. The bedrock is close to the surface on both sides, which means a solid foundation without deep excavation. The channel above would fill naturally from runoff. The spillway would need to sit here." She tapped the eastern bank to allow overflow without undermining the base. He looked at the point she was indicating. He had ridden past that spot 100 times without seeing what she was describing. He said, "My father talked about building something there once. Never got around to it." She straightened up. "The land has been waiting for it," she said. He looked at the diagram for another long moment. Then he said, "It is months of work, maybe longer. 2 people, limited tools, no guarantee it works at all." She said, "And if you do nothing." He looked up at her. She said, "The well drops a foot a week. At that rate, you have perhaps 5 weeks before it runs dry. Without water, the cattle die. Without cattle, there is no income. Without income, the bank calls the note." She said it plainly, without cruelty. She was not telling him things he did not know. She was telling him she knew them too, and that she was not looking away. He said, "So we build." She said, "So we build." They shook hands there at the kitchen table. which was not a romantic gesture and was not meant to be one. It was two practical people making an agreement. Her grip was firm, and her palm was calloused, and when she pulled her hand back, he felt the absence of it in a way he did not examine. He said, "We start tomorrow, first light." She said, "I will have breakfast ready at 4. They went down to the creek bed that afternoon to begin marking the foundation line. Caleb drove the stakes while Nora ran string between them, measuring and adjusting until the line sat exactly where she wanted it. The sun was hard and high, and the soil was so dry it cracked in hexagonal plates like old pottery. And they worked without talking because talking required energy they were putting into the work. At one point, Nora was scrambling up the steeper eastern bank to check the sight line for the spillway position, and a chunk of the bank gave way under her boot. She caught herself on both hands, but the edge of a half-buried stone caught her left palm and opened a shallow cut across the base of her thumb. She did not make a sound. She sat down on the bank and looked at her hand and pressed the hem of her apron against it. Caleb was beside her before he had decided to move. He crouched down and took her hand without asking. He had a clean cloth in his shirt pocket, a habit from years of working with tools, and he folded it and pressed it to the cut and wrapped it once around her palm and tied it off with a neat knot. His hands were rough, calloused from the same kind of work, worn down by the same kind of land. He was aware of that as he worked, the similarity of texture. Two pairs of hands that knew what labor felt like. He tied the knot. His hands stilled. He did not release her hand immediately. A second passed, then another. He let go and stood up and looked out across the dry creek bed as though checking something in the distance. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You should put something on that tonight. I have iodine in the barn." She said, "I will find it." He went back to driving stakes. She went back to running string. Neither of them mentioned the pause, but it was there, small and quiet and real. The way the first change in the air is real before a storm, before you can see any clouds, before you can say with any certainty that something is coming. You just know. That night, unable to sleep, Caleb went out to the hillside north of the house. He had not planned to go there. His feet carried him in that direction, and he let them, the way you sometimes allow yourself to do the thing you have been not doing for too long. The two graves sat side by side on the gentle rise, just as he had placed them, with a clear view south over the valley. Ruth had loved that view. She had talked about building a bench up here someday, somewhere to sit in the evenings and watch the light change over the plains. They had never built the bench. The wooden markers he had carved himself were weathered now, the names worn slightly, but still legible. Ruth Mason. Clara Mason. He stood between them in the dark and did not say anything for a long time. He had said everything already, in the weeks after, when he came up here every night because he could not stand the house. He had said it all until the words stopped meaning anything, and he had stopped coming. He sat down in the dry grass. The valley spread below him, dark and vast, a landscape that in another season would have been beautiful and was now just evidence of everything the drought had taken. He thought about the diagram on the kitchen table, about a woman who had arrived with nothing and within 8 days had looked at his dying land and seen something he had stopped being able to see, which was possibility. He thought about Ruth, who had always been the one who saw possibility, who had looked at this rough ranch when they were young and seen not what it was but what it could become, who had told him once that the difference between people who built things and people who watched things fall apart was simply the willingness to start. He sat there until the cold came up through the ground and into his bones. Then he stood up and walked back to the house. 2 weeks after Nora arrived, they rode into Redemption. The town sat in the valley like a collection of sun-bleached structures with no particular ambition. Its main street was a straight line of dust between buildings that had seen better decades. Edgar Pruitt's general store occupied the largest corner, a 2-story frame building with a porch wide enough to hold a conversation and a reputation for being the place in Redemption where information traveled before it traveled anywhere else. Caleb tied his horse at the rail. He helped Nora down, aware of the eyes already watching from the store windows in the street, aware that a strange woman riding into town with Caleb Mason was the kind of thing that would be discussed at every supper table in the valley by nightfall. He said quietly, "Let me do most of the talking at first. Some of these men take a while to hear something if it comes from someone they don't already know." She said, "Of course." He heard what was underneath that "of course," which was that she understood the calculus of being a woman in a room of skeptical men perfectly well and had been navigating it for longer than he had been aware it was something that required navigation. Inside, 3 men stood at Pruitt's counter. Desmond Rafferty, whose land ran along the valley's eastern edge and who had 3 sons broad enough to move mountains if someone would point them in the right direction. Harlan Voss, a quiet man who ran sheep on the southern section and kept mostly to himself, and Edgar Pruitt himself, cleaning his spectacles with the methodical patience of a man who had seen a great deal of trouble come through his door and was not particularly surprised by any of it. They all looked up when Caleb and Nora entered. Caleb presented the plan, the dam, the cooperative structure, the idea that water captured on Mason land could benefit the whole valley if managed fairly. He kept his voice level and his words plain. He did not oversell it. He laid out the math the way Nora had laid it out to him, the wells dropping, the timeline, the alternative which was no alternative at all. The men listened. Then they said what men who are frightened say, which is not "I am frightened," but rather "it sounds complicated," and who is to say it would work? N-Cross has lawyers. Desmond Rafferty turned his attention to Nora, who had been standing quietly to Caleb's left. He said, "Who might you be, and what stake do you have in this valley's water?" He was not hostile. He was simply a man who needed to understand before he could commit to anything. Before Caleb could speak, Nora said, "My name is Nora Elliot. I work for Mr. Mason." She paused and let that settle before continuing. "I have measured the water remaining in the Mason Creek bed. I have calculated the volume a dam at the Northern Narrows could hold, and compared it to current consumption rates for livestock in this valley. At the present rate of well depletion, most operations here have between 4 and 7 weeks before they face a genuine crisis. A dam of the size I am proposing would provide a reserve sufficient to carry the valley through a drought lasting twice as long as the current one, provided it is managed equitably among all parties who contribute to its construction." The room was very quiet. She said, "If you would like to discuss my qualifications rather than those numbers, that is your choice to make. But the numbers will be the same either way." Rafferty looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Then he looked back at the diagram she had unfolded on Pruitt's counter. He said, "I have 3 sons with nothing to do since our herd dropped to nothing. Strong backs and idle hands." He rubbed his jaw. "What do you need?" Harlan Cross arrived at the ranch the following afternoon. Caleb was working at the dam site with a shovel, clearing loose soil from what would become the foundation trench. He heard the horse before he saw it and straightened up to find a rider coming from the south on an animal that cost more than most men in this valley earned in 2 years. Cross was in his middle 50s, heavy-set in the way of a man who had once worked hard and now worked differently. He was dressed well without being showy, a quality that took money to achieve. His face had the settled confidence of someone who had spent decades being the largest figure in any room he entered and had long since stopped noticing it. He pulled up at the edge of the construction site and looked at the staked-out foundation with an expression that was almost curious. He said, "Caleb, heard you were building something out here. Wanted to see for myself." Caleb set the shovel down but did not step toward him. He said, "Mr. Cross, it is a free country." Cross dismounted slowly, the way men do when they want you to understand they are not in a hurry. He walked the length of the foundation line, looking at the stakes and string, looking at the creek bed, looking at everything with the assessing gaze of a man who measures things in terms of what they might be worth. He said, "A dam, I take it." Caleb said, "That is the plan." Cross clasped his hands behind his back. He said, "You understand that the water this creek carries comes down through my property before it reaches you. My cattle have depended on that downstream flow for 30 years. If you impound water here, you reduce what reaches the southern valley." Caleb said, "The creek has been bone dry since April. There is nothing flowing to anyone." Cross acknowledged this with a slight movement of his head that was not quite agreement. He said, "But when it rains again, which it will, eventually." Caleb said, "When it rains, the dam will catch what falls on my land and keep it from running off and evaporating. Water that is currently being wasted." He paused. "A spillway will allow managed flow downstream. Your cattle will not go without." Cross looked at him. He said, "I have made you an offer for this property before. I am prepared to make it again and to improve upon it. The drought is going to take this ranch one way or another, Caleb. The smart move is to take the money while there is still money to take." Caleb said, "Not interested." Cross studied him for a long moment. Then his gaze moved past Caleb to where Nora had appeared from the direction of the barn, a bucket in each hand, walking toward the cattle pen with the unhurried purposefulness that characterized everything she did. Cross said, "Who is that?" Caleb said, "She works here." Cross said, "I heard the man she was corresponding with, the one from the dry goods operation, decided not to meet the train. Gerald Mott has been handling freight for my operation for 4 years now. We talk." He said it with no particular inflection, as though it were a piece of passing information, something he had happened to hear somewhere. Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Not anger, exactly. Something colder and more deliberate than anger. Cross remounted. He said, "Think about my offer, Caleb. The land is not going to get less dry." He rode south. Caleb stood watching him go until the sound of the horse faded into the flat distance. Then he turned and looked at Nora, who had set her buckets down and was watching him from across the yard with an expression he was beginning to recognize. Not alarm, not distress. The careful attentiveness of a woman who had learned long ago to assess situations accurately and quickly. He walked over to her. She said, "Who was that?" He said, "Harlan Cross. He owns most of the valley and wants the rest." She waited. He said, "He mentioned Gerald Mott. Mott works freight for Cross. Has for 4 years." She was still for a moment. Then she said, "I see." She nodded slowly, taking this in, reorganizing it into whatever picture she was constructing of how things stood. She did not say it changes everything, because it did not change what needed to be done. It simply clarified why certain things had happened the way they had. She said, "Then we work faster." He said, "Agreed." That evening, Nora found a sealed envelope tucked beneath the seat of the supply wagon Pruitt had sent out that morning. No name on the front, no return address. Inside was a railway ticket, single passage, redemption to San Francisco, departing the following Tuesday. Beside it, a single sheet of paper with 4 words written in a hand she did not recognize. "This is my kindness." She held the ticket for a long moment. She looked out the window at the creek bed where the foundation stake still stood in the failing light, pale as bones in dry earth. She looked at the diagram on the kitchen table, the one she had drawn from memory, the one Caleb had studied for 20 minutes without speaking. She folded the ticket once. She carried it upstairs and opened the lid of her trunk and placed it beneath the hydraulic engineering book at the very bottom, under everything she owned. Then she came back downstairs and put the kettle on. She did not tell Caleb. There was nothing to tell. She had already decided, and decisions that are truly made do not require announcement. That night, long past the hour when the house had gone quiet, Caleb came back from the barn after checking on a horse that had been favoring its left front leg. The windows of the house were dark except for one, the small window of Nora's room on the upper left, where a thin line of lamplight showed under the curtain. He stood in the yard for a moment and looked at that light. He thought about what it meant that for the first time in 2 years, there was a light in that window. He thought about what it meant that the kitchen had smelled like coffee and food and warm mornings again. That the house had sounds in it, footsteps and pages turning and the small domestic movements of another person going about their living. He thought about the envelope in the kitchen drawer. Something about this night made the envelope feel different than it usually felt, less like a sealed wound and more like a door he had been standing in front of for a very long time. He did not open it, but he stood there in the dark yard for a long time, looking up at the stars and then at the line of lamplight under Nora's curtain. And he thought that Ruth had always said the thing about fear was not that it went away. The thing about fear was that at some point you had to decide it was not going to be the last word. He went inside. He went upstairs. He heard pages turning. He went to his own room. He lay down in the dark. And for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, the silence of the house felt less like absence and more like something waiting, patient and unhurried, to become what it was supposed to be. He was asleep before he had finished thinking the thought. Outside, the stars moved across the Texas sky the way they always had, indifferent to drought and grief and the slow business of 2 people learning to trust each other. The plains lay still and dark and impossibly wide, and somewhere under all that sky the creek bed waited, dry and patient, for something to change. The work changed when the others came. It changed in the way that all solitary things change when they become communal, not just in speed or efficiency, but in character. The dam site, which had been for 2 weeks a quiet and almost private undertaking, became something louder and more complicated, and, in ways Caleb had not anticipated, something more alive. Desmond Rafferty arrived first on the morning they had agreed upon, before sunrise, his 3 sons riding behind him in a line like something out of a painting of men who did not know they were being looked at. The boys were broad and serious in the way of young men who have grown up working and have not yet learned to be self-conscious about their own capability. The eldest was 19. The youngest was 9, and had come along because Rafferty said leaving him behind was more trouble than bringing him. Cormac Bello came next, arriving with a wagon loaded with stone tools Caleb had never seen before, implements for shaping and testing rock that spoke of knowledge carried in the hands rather than learned from books. He was a compact man with forearms like rope and the economy of movement that belongs to people who have been doing physical work for so long that waste has simply left the system. He spoke little. When he did speak, it was worth hearing. Edgar Pruitt sent his wagon ahead with supplies and arrived himself an hour later on a horse that he rode with the careful dignity of a man who had reached the age where comfort on a saddle required negotiation. He brought ledger books and a surveyor's tape and a pencil tucked behind each ear and set himself up on a flat rock near the site with the air of a man who had found his natural purpose. By mid-morning, there were 11 people at the dam site, including the Rafferty boys, and the quality of the silence had changed entirely. Nora moved through the organized chaos with a quietness that Caleb found himself tracking without intention. She did not direct from above. She did not make announcements or take visible command of anything. She simply appeared where things needed to happen, and things happened. When Cormac was trying to explain to the older Rafferty boys the principle of interlocking stone without a common language of technical terms, she crouched down in the dirt beside them and drew the geometry with her finger, and the boys understood immediately. When Pruitt's supply inventory was coming up short on the mortar aggregate they needed, she recalculated the mixture ratio to stretch what they had without compromising the structural integrity, and she explained her reasoning to Cormac, who listened with his head tilted slightly and then nodded once, which from Cormac was the equivalent of high praise. She organized the food rotation without being asked to, because she noticed early that men working at this pace would lose efficiency dramatically without regular water and calories, and loss of efficiency on a project with a deadline was something she treated as a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be accepted. At mid-morning, he was hauling stone from the pile Cormac had graded and sorted the previous afternoon when he looked up and saw Nora crouched beside the youngest Rafferty boy at the edge of the work area. The boy, who was 9 and named Clement, and who had arrived this morning with the determined expression of someone intending to be useful, had encountered one of the larger draft horses at close range and gone completely still with the particular stillness of a child who is frightened but has decided that showing it would be worse than enduring it. Nora had set down whatever she was carrying and crouched to the boy's level without making a production of it. Caleb was too far away to hear what she said. He saw her take the boy's hand and place it on the horse's nose, guiding it slowly, and the horse lowered its head in the patient way of animals that have been around people long enough to understand them. The boy's posture changed. His shoulders dropped. He reached out his other hand. Nora said something, and the boy laughed. It was a small thing. A child and a horse and a woman taking 30 seconds to make the world manageable for someone who was having a hard moment. It was not extraordinary by any reasonable measure. Caleb stood with a stone in his arms and did not move for longer than was strictly necessary. He set the stone down and went back to work, and did not think about it again with any deliberateness. But it sat somewhere in him for the rest of the day like a coal that has stopped burning openly, but has not stopped being warm. On the 10th night of building, after the workers had gone home and Pruitt's figures for the day had been tallied and the tools had been put away, Caleb and Nora sat beside the fire they had kept burning at the site. They did this most evenings now. It had become a kind of ritual without either of them naming it as such. The last hour before they rode back to the house, when the work was done and the quiet came back and the fire made the darkness manageable. Usually they talked about practical things, progress on the foundation, material needs for the following day. The calculations Nora updated each evening in the small notebook she carried in her apron pocket. But that night, the practical things ran out sooner than usual, and what was left was the fire and the dark and the sound of the planes breathing around them. Nora spoke first. She said, "My father used to say that water never argues with the land. It just finds the lowest point and goes there. He said that was the most honest thing in nature. Water does not pretend. It does not try to go uphill. It just follows the truth of the ground beneath it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sounds like a man who thought carefully about things." She said, "He thought about everything carefully, slowly and carefully, and always from first principles. He drove my mother to distraction sometimes because he would not commit to an opinion until he had examined it from every angle." She paused. "I think I got that from him, the needing to understand before I can proceed." He said, "There are worse inheritances." She looked at the fire. She said, "He died on a Tuesday in March. I was 16. He had been sick for 3 months, but we did not know how sick because he did not tell us. He did not want us to worry, which was generous and also terrible because we had no time to prepare." She said this without self-pity, simply as a fact she had long since finished grieving and now carried the way you carry things that have become part of your architecture. She said, "I think that is why I dislike not knowing things. It is a way of not being caught without preparation again." Caleb looked at the fire for a long time. Then he said, "Ruth wrote me a letter before she died." Nora did not move. She did not turn to look at him. She simply stayed very still, the way you stay when someone is on the edge of saying something, and any response might tip them back to silence. He said, "She gave it to her sister, said to give it to me only if she did not come through. Her sister brought it to me at the graveside." He stopped. He said, "I have had it for 2 years in the kitchen drawer. I have not opened it." A long pause. The fire shifted and resettled. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because when I open it, I have to live through her dying again. And I have to hear whatever she wanted to say to me, which might be things I am not ready to hear. And after that, I have to keep going. And for a long time, I did not know what keep going meant or whether it was something I was capable of." He said the last part quietly, without drama, the way people speak about true things when they have been carrying them alone for long enough that the weight has become familiar. Nora set down her coffee cup. She reached across the small distance between them and placed her hand over his. Not with pressure, not with urgency. Simply placed it there the way you place something carefully on a surface you do not want to disturb. She said nothing. The fire said more than either of them. The plains extended in every direction without opinion. And in the space between what had been said and what did not need to be said, something settled between them that had been unsettled for weeks. A kind of recognition, the acknowledgement that they were both people who had lost the future they had planned and were still, somehow, here. After a while, she took her hand back. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. He said, "We should get back." She said, "Yes." they rode back to the ranch in the dark without talking, and the silence between them was fuller and more careful than it had been before. The silence of two people who have said something real and are treating it gently on the way home. Gerald Mott arrived on a Tuesday. He came in the early afternoon, when the work was at full pace and the site was busy with people, which Caleb later thought was probably not a coincidence. A man like Mott, sent on an errand like this, would want an audience. An audience made refusal more complicated and acceptance more visible. He was a broad man in his early 40s with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors doing work that was not particularly kind to the body. He rode a good horse that he sat poorly, the horse better quality than the man warranted. He pulled up at the edge of the site and looked around at the activity with an expression that was working hard to project confidence and not entirely succeeding. He asked for Nora Elliot. The name passed through the group in the particular way of a name that does not belong to the place it has been spoken in, and people turned and looked, and Nora came out from the area where she had been working alongside Cormac at the eastern wall. She stood 20 feet from him and looked at him without any visible change in her expression. He said, "Miss Elliot, Mr. Cross asked me to extend an offer on his behalf. He is prepared to cover your travel expenses to San Francisco, first-class accommodation, a sum sufficient to establish yourself comfortably on arrival. He asks only that you leave within 3 days. He said, 'The business with the dam will resolve itself one way or another.' This is a separate matter between you and him, a gesture of goodwill." The site had gone very quiet. Not the quiet of people who have stopped working, the quiet of people who are still holding their tools, but have stopped using them, which is different and more attentive. Nora looked at Gerald Mott for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was even and unhurried and carried clearly across the silent site. She said, "You came to the station at Redemption. On the second day I was there. The station master saw you from the window. You rode up from the south, you looked across the street, and then you turned your horse and left." She paused. "I am right about that, aren't I?" Gerald Mott said nothing. His jaw moved slightly but produced no words. She said, "That is my answer to Mr. Cross's offer." She turned around. She picked up the tool she had set down. She went back to work. Gerald Mott sat on his horse for a moment longer, in the particular discomfort of a man who has come to deliver a message and finds himself instead in a story where he is not the protagonist and not the villain, but simply the person who did the cowardly thing and has been asked to stand in it. Then Caleb stepped forward. He did not say anything. He did not reach for anything. He simply moved to stand between Gerald Mott and Nora's back, squarely and without hurry, and he looked at Mott with the patient directness of a man who has decided how long he is willing to wait. Gerald Mott looked back at him for one moment. Then he turned his horse and rode south without another word. The sound of tools and work returned to the site within seconds, the way sound returns after a stone has been dropped in water and the ripples have passed. Caleb did not turn around immediately. He stood facing south for a moment, watching the dust from Mott's horse settle back into the air. Then he turned and said her name. Not Miss Elliot, Nora. She was already looking at him over her shoulder. She stopped walking. He said, "I want you to know that whatever Cross offers, whatever pressure he brings, your position at the ranch is not contingent on any of it. You stay as long as you choose to stay." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I know." He said, "I am not sure I have said it clearly before." She said, You have said it clearly enough." She held his gaze for one beat more than was purely practical. Then she said, "I stay because I choose to, Caleb Mason. Not because I have nowhere else to go." It was the first time she had used his first name without the surname after it. It sat between them, small and definitive, like a stone placed to mark a position. She went back to work. He went back to work. The dam rose another 6 inches by the end of the day. The legal document arrived on a Wednesday, delivered by a man in a suit who rode out from town with the careful bearing of someone who has been paid to be unpleasant and has made his peace with it. He was Cross's attorney from Austin, a man named Whitfield, who had the kind of face that expressed nothing on purpose. He produced a document from his saddlebag and presented it to Caleb at the construction site with a brief summary of its contents. It was a cease and desist order from the county court. Temporary suspension of all construction pending a formal hearing on downstream water rights. The hearing was set for 3 weeks hence. Caleb took the document. He read it. He handed it to Edgar Pruitt. Pruitt read it twice, cleaning his spectacles between readings. Then he said, "This is a temporary order, not an injunction. There is a material difference. A temporary order is a request backed by a court's authority. An injunction is a command backed by a court's enforcement mechanism." He tapped the paper. "This is the first, not the second." Caleb said, "Meaning what, exactly?" Pruitt said, "Meaning we have 3 weeks before they can compel you to stop. After that depends on the hearing." He looked at the dam over his spectacles. "How much do you need to complete it?" Nora said, 3 days of full labor." Pruitt said, "Then we have 17 days of margin." But they did not have 17 days. They discovered this the following morning. Caleb went to the well at dawn as he always did. He lowered the bucket. He heard it hit bottom before it hit water. He pulled it up and looked into it and saw dampness along one side where it had dragged against the wall, a thin dark line that was the last evidence of what had been there. The well was dry. He stood beside it for a long time in the gray early light. He heard the back door of the house open and Nora's footsteps crossing the yard. He did not turn around. He heard her stop behind him and understood from the silence that she had grasped the situation without needing it explained. He set the bucket down on the stone rim of the well. He sat down on the ground beside it, his back against the stone, and he put his face in his hands. He did not make a sound, but his shoulders moved. It was not a collapse. It was not dramatic. It was the small, private convulsion of a man who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time, and has simply, for one moment, lost the ability to hold it steadily. Nora sat down beside him in the dirt, not across from him, beside him, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. She did not speak. She did not offer solutions or comfort or perspective. She simply sat there with him in the gray morning light and was present in the way that presence is sometimes the only honest offering. A minute passed, maybe 2. Then she stood up. She said, "We finished the dam today." He looked up at her. She said, "Not tomorrow. Today." She met his eyes without wavering. "We call everyone back. We work from now until it is done. Because if we do not, nothing else matters anyway." He looked at her face in the early light, the steadiness of it, the refusal to perform optimism or to pretend the situation was other than it was, and underneath that refusal, the absolute bedrock conviction that they were going to do this thing anyway. He said, "That is 3 days of work." She said, "Then we make it 1. He got to his feet. He said, "I will send Rafferty's oldest boy out to call the others." She said, "I will start breakfast for whoever arrives first." He nodded. She turned toward the house. He watched her go for a moment. This woman who had arrived on his porch with a trunk full of books and nowhere to go, who had looked at his dying land and seen something worth saving, who had sat beside him in the dirt at the worst moment of his morning and asked nothing of him except that he stand up again. He said, "Nora." She stopped. He said, "Thank you." She stood with her back to him for a moment. Then she said, "We are not done yet, Caleb Mason." She went inside. He walked to the barn to saddle the horse. Above the eastern hills, the sky was turning from gray to a particular shade of pale gold that made no promises but left the door open. It was not hope exactly. It was what came before hope. The condition that hope requires. They came before sunrise. 31 people arrived at the Mason Ranch in the gray hour before dawn, answering the call that Rafferty's eldest son had carried through the valley on horseback the previous evening. They came in wagons and on horseback, and 2 families came on foot because their horses had been sold months ago to cover debts that the drought had made unpayable. They brought tools and rope and whatever timber they could spare. And they brought themselves, which was the most valuable thing, the simple fact of their presence, the declaration that this fight belonged to all of them. Caleb stood in the yard and watched them come and felt something move through him that he had no clean name for. Not quite gratitude. Something older and less articulate than gratitude. The recognition that he was not, in fact, alone in the world, which was something he had managed to forget over 2 years of grief and isolation, and the pride of a man who has convinced himself that needing no one is the same as being strong. Nora had breakfast ready for the first arrivals before the sun cleared the eastern hills. She had been in the kitchen since 3 in the morning, which he knew because he had not slept and had heard her moving. He had not gone down. There were things a person needed to do alone, and preparation was sometimes one of them. By the time the last wagon arrived, the dam site was already alive with organized movement. Cormac Belleau took command of the stonework without ceremony, directing the Rafferty boys and 4 other men to the final section of the western wall where the gap remained. He communicated primarily through demonstration, picking up a stone, turning it in his hands, finding the face that wanted to sit against its neighbor, placing it with a precision that looked effortless because it had been practiced for 30 years. The men watched and learned and worked, and the wall climbed. Desmond Rafferty organized the mortar operation with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting for something useful to do. His middle son, 17 years old and built like a draft horse, hauled aggregate from the pile Cormac had graded and mixed it with the water they had hauled in barrels from town at first light. The mortar came out right on the first batch, and this small success put a particular energy into the group that good early results always do. Edgar Pruitt sat on his flat rock with his ledger and his pencil and kept track of what was being used and what remained and how much time each stage was taking, doing the arithmetic of completion in the margins of his pages and updating his estimates every hour. At 10 in the morning, he called Caleb over and showed him the numbers. He said, "If the current pace holds, you will have the main walls finished by early afternoon. The spillway gates are the critical path. Those need to be set and tested before you can call it done." Caleb said, "How long for the gates?" Pruitt said, 2 hours if nothing goes wrong." He paused. "Things usually go wrong." Caleb said, "Then we leave extra time." He went back to work. The accident happened at 11:30. Owen Rafferty, the The middle son, 17 years old and strong enough to make his father quietly proud, was helping to guide a large capstone into position on the eastern wall. The stone weighed perhaps 250 pounds, a dense piece of pale limestone that Cormac had selected specifically for the crest because of its flat upper surface and its resistance to water intrusion. 4 men were managing it on ropes, walking it up the temporary ramp they had built from salvaged timber. The ramp held, the ropes held, the men held, the footing did not. A section of the earthen ramp gave way under Owen's right boot at the moment of maximum load, and his leg went through the surface at an angle that legs are not designed to go. The stone swung on its ropes. The other 3 men compensated and kept it from falling entirely, which probably saved Owen from something far worse. But the sound that came from him was a sound that stopped every person on the site simultaneously, the involuntary sound of a body receiving damage it had not consented to. The stone was lowered. People moved toward Owen. He was sitting in the dirt with both hands braced behind him and his right leg extended in a way that was immediately, visibly wrong. He was not crying. He was a Rafferty. And Rafferty men had been raised to treat pain as an administrative matter rather than an emotional one. But his face had gone the color of old ash, and there was a fine shine of sweat across his forehead that said clearly enough what he would not say aloud. Desmond Rafferty was beside his son in seconds. He was a practical man and a good father, which meant he was also terrified, which meant he needed someone to tell him what to do. Nora was already moving. She had been on the far side of the site when it happened, and she covered the distance without running, which was a choice, because running communicates panic, and panic is contagious, and what this situation required was the opposite of panic. She arrived, crouched down, and assessed the leg with her hands before she said a word. She said, "Owen, look at me." He looked at her. His jaw was tight and his breathing was shallow, and his hands were pressing into the ground behind him as though trying to push himself away from the pain. She said, "I am going to touch your leg now. I need you to tell me where it hurts the most. Can you do that?" He said, "Yes, ma'am," in a voice that was remarkably steady for a boy his age in his situation. She ran her hands along the tibia from ankle to knee with the practiced, deliberate touch of someone who has read enough about doing it that the knowledge has become muscle memory. She found what she was looking for at the midshaft, the wrong give of bone beneath the surface, the asymmetry that should not have been there. She looked up at Desmond Rafferty. She said, "It is a clean break. Mid-shaft tibia. It has not displaced significantly, which means the leg is stable for now, but it needs to be immobilized before he is moved." Rafferty said, "What do you need?" She said, 2 straight lengths of timber, approximately this long." She held her hands apart to show him. "A clean cloth or 2. She looked down at her own apron, made a decision, and untied it. She tore it in a long strip with the clean efficiency of someone who has weighed sentiment against necessity and made the right choice. Someone brought the timber. She set the splint herself, positioning the lengths of wood along either side of the leg while directing 2 other men to hold Owen steady. She bound it with the apron strips at 3 points, firm enough to immobilize, not so tight as to restrict circulation. She told Owen to press 2 fingers against his own ankle and tell her if the feeling changed. He did. It did not. She said, "Good. You are going to be all right, Owen. The bone is broken, but it is not complicated. It needs to be set properly by a doctor in town, but it will heal clean." Owen Rafferty, 17 years old, with his father crouched beside him and 30 people looking on, said, "Yes, ma'am." And then, after a pause that lasted exactly as long as his composure required, he said, "Can we finish the dam first?" A sound went through the crowd, not quite laughter. The warmth that rises when someone young and in pain chooses dignity over complaint. Nora looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "The dam will be finished today, whether you are here or not. What you are going to do is let your father take you to town and let Dr. Hale set that leg properly." Owen looked at his father. Rafferty nodded once, the nod of a man who is grateful beyond his vocabulary and knows it. He looked up at Nora and said, "Thank you." She said, "Go. Both of you." They went. The work continued. The dam was finished at 4:30 in the afternoon. Not with ceremony, not with announcement. Cormac Belleau set the last stone on the spillway casing, pressed the mortar into the joint with his thumb, stood back, and looked at the structure with the squinting, critical gaze of a craftsman evaluating his own work. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said one word in French that Caleb did not speak, but that carried clearly enough by tone. It was finished. The spillway gates were tested twice. They opened and closed as designed. The overflow channels were clear. The mortar joints were solid throughout. Edgar Pruitt walked the full length of the structure with his hand trailing along the stone face, and then walked it again and wrote something in his ledger and underlined it. People gathered. There was no speech. There was simply the collective recognition of people who have worked alongside each other past the edge of what they thought was possible and arrived somewhere they did not entirely believe they would reach. Caleb stood at the center of the dam and looked at what 31 people had built in a single day and felt the strangeness of seeing something exist that had not existed that morning. He looked for Nora. She was at the edge of the group, slightly apart, watching the structure with her arms crossed and her head tilted at the angle she had when she was calculating something. She was still wearing the apron that was missing its lower half. He walked over to her. She said, without looking away from the dam, "The mortar will need 72 hours to cure fully before it can bear water pressure. We will need to watch the base joints if rain comes sooner than that." He said, "I know." She said, "The spillway gate mechanism is functional, but the eastern pivot is stiff. Someone should grease it before it has to bear any real load." He said, "Cormac already has it on his list." She said, "Good." A pause. She was still looking at the dam. He said, "You should be proud of this." She turned and looked at him then. Something in her expression shifted, not to the softness of sentiment, but to something more durable than softness. The expression of a person who has done a hard thing well and is allowing themselves, just briefly, to know it. She said, "We should be proud of this." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. The sun was dropping toward the western edge of the plains, and the site was beginning to quiet as people gathered tools and began the slow business of leaving. The light had gone that deep gold that October evenings in Texas produce, the color of things that are ending but not yet ended. Nobody left immediately. They stood around in the cooling air and talked with the ease of people who have shared something difficult and come through it together, and the sound of that, the simple human sound of people talking without fear or urgency, was something Caleb had not heard in this valley in a very long time. He woke at midnight to the sound of hoofbeats, not one horse, many, moving with the directional certainty of people who know exactly where they are going. He was out of bed and at the window before the sound fully resolved itself into meaning. He looked south and saw the torches. 6 of them, maybe 8, moving in a line along the valley floor from the direction of Cross's land, heading north toward the creek, toward the dam. He dressed in 30 seconds and took the rifle from beside the door and went downstairs. Nora was already in the kitchen. She had heard it too. She was dressed and holding the shotgun she had taken from the barn rack 2 weeks ago and learned to load without being asked. Her face was the face she wore for difficult things, composed and present and utterly without the luxury of hesitation. He said, "How many?" She said, 8 riders. I counted the torches from the upstairs window. He said, "Stay behind me." She said, "No." There was no time to argue, and she knew it, and he knew it, and they went out together into the October night. The riders were already at the dam site when Caleb and Nora arrived at a run. They had spread out along the southern bank in a line, torches held high, and in the torchlight, Caleb could see what they had brought with them. Not just weapons, equipment. The kind of equipment used for demolition work. The man at the center was large and wore no identifying markers and had the flat professional expression of someone who is paid for results and has no particular feelings about the results themselves. He looked at Caleb coming up from the north bank and said, "This doesn't need to be complicated. We are here to do a job. Step back and let us do it, and nobody gets hurt." Caleb said, "Get off my land." The man said, "Mr. Cross has an interest in what gets built on this waterway." He said, "Call it a dispute resolution before the court has to settle it." Caleb said, "The court has a hearing scheduled 3 weeks from now. You want to dispute something? Dispute it there." The man looked at the dam with the assessing gaze of a professional estimating how long a job will take. He said, "Courts are slow. Mr. Cross prefers to work efficiently." He nodded to the men beside him. 2 of them dismounted and moved toward the base of the dam. Nora raised the shotgun. She said, "I would ask you to stop." Her voice was the same voice she used for everything, not loud, not theatrical, just absolutely clear. The voice of a woman who has decided exactly where she stands and has no interest in moving. The 2 men stopped. The leader looked at her with something that was almost appreciation. He said, "Ma'am, I do not want to make this difficult for you." She said, "Then don't." A standoff. Torchlight on water, or what would soon be water if the rains came. 8 men with equipment and 2 people with firearms, and the vast dark of the Texas night pressing in from all sides. Then, from the darkness to the east, a voice called out. It was Desmond Rafferty. He came over the rise with his 2 older sons behind him, all 3 of them armed, moving at a pace that suggested they had been riding hard. Behind them, more shapes in the darkness, more horses, more people emerging from the black into the orange edge of the torchlight. Edgar Pruitt. Cormac Belleau, with something in each hand that Caleb decided not to examine too closely. A half-dozen other families from the valley, men and women both, arriving from 2 directions at once with the coordinated efficiency of people who had been warned this might happen and had made arrangements accordingly. Within 4 minutes, the 8 riders were surrounded by 23. Rafferty said from horseback, "I believe you gentlemen are outnumbered." The leader assessed the situation with the professional calm of a man recalculating a job's risk-reward ratio. He looked at his 8. He looked at the 23. He looked at the dam, solid and complete in the torchlight, built from stone that would take more than 1 night's work to dismantle. One of his men, the younger one on the far left, shifted in his saddle, and the shift communicated something clearly to anyone watching, which was that he had not signed on for a confrontation of this scale and was privately reconsidering his career choices. Then it happened. The leader reached into his coat and produced a small object and dropped it onto the ground near the base of the dam. The fuse was already lit. It had been lit. Caleb understood immediately, before they arrived, held carefully between two fingers, waiting for the moment it would be needed. The fuse burned toward the packed earth at the dam's base. It happened in the interval between one heartbeat and the next, that suspension of time that occurs when the situation changes faster than understanding can follow. Nora ran. She crossed the ground between herself and the fuse in a straight line. No hesitation, no pause for calculation, just the pure physical commitment of someone who has made a decision before the decision was required. She reached the fuse and brought her boot down on it, and in the same motion kicked it sideways into the dry channel beside the dam's eastern base, where it detonated against the stone. The explosion was small, contained. A sharp concussive sound and a spray of dirt and gravel from the channel floor. The dam did not move. Nora went down, not because of the explosion, because her boot had caught the edge of the channel and her ankle had folded under her on the way back, and she hit the ground on her hands and one knee, with a sound that Caleb heard across the entire site. He was beside her before the dust settled. He crouched down, and his hands found her face in the dark and tilted it up toward the torchlight, and he said her name. Not Miss Elliot. Not even just Nora. He said Nora. And it came out in a voice he did not recognize as his own, low and stripped of everything except the immediate and unmanageable fact of his fear for her. She looked up at him. Her palms were scraped, and her right hand had taken the heat of the fuse close enough to leave a mark, but her eyes were clear and present and characteristically direct. She said, "I am all right." He said, "Your hand." She said, "It is not serious." She turned to look at the dam. "The dam is fine." He looked at her hand anyway. He held it in both of his in the torchlight and looked at the burn across the base of her palm and felt something move through him that was not anger and was not relief and was not gratitude, but contained all three of them and several other things, besides that he was not prepared to name in the middle of a field at midnight with 23 people watching. Behind them, the situation resolved itself without further incident. The leader, whose professional assessment of the evening had moved firmly into the column of complications not worth the fee, turned his horse around. His men followed. They rode south without another word, the torches diminishing into the dark until they were nothing. Rafferty called something after them in a voice that carried the satisfaction of a man who has been waiting a long time to say something he means entirely. Then the tension broke the way tension does when the immediate danger has passed, all at once and completely, and people began talking and moving, and someone laughed and someone else put their hand on their neighbor's shoulder, and the ordinary human sounds of relief and camaraderie filled the night air. Caleb helped Nora to her feet. She stood beside him and looked at the dam, solid in the torchlight, unmoved by everything that had been attempted against it. She said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "We should have someone watch it through the night. The mortar is still curing." He said, "I will ask Rafferty." She said, "Good." He said, "Nora." She turned and looked at him. The torchlight was warm on her face, and her hand was still in his, and neither of them had moved to change that. He said, "What you did." She said, "It was the practical thing to do." He said, It was not the safe thing to do. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Some things are worth the risk." He held her gaze. He held it long enough that the watching crowd became irrelevant, long enough that the words he was not saying became as present as the words he was. Then he said, "Let me look at your hand in the light." She said, "All right." They walked back toward the ranch together, leaving the dam in the care of Rafferty and his sons, who settled into their posts with the satisfied competence of people doing something that matters. And behind them the structure stood against the dark sky, stone upon stone upon stone, built by 31 people who had decided that some things were worth building even when the outcome was uncertain. 3 days later, Caleb Mason walked into the county courthouse at Redemption. He had one suit. He had bought it for his wedding and worn it twice since. It fit him the same way it always had, which was enough. Nora walked beside him in a dress that the women of the valley had assembled for her from 2 different bolts of fabric that Pruitt had ordered from San Antonio and presented to her without comment 2 days prior, which was the most articulate thing he had said in years. Behind them, the valley came. The courthouse at Redemption held perhaps 80 people comfortably. 114 came. They filled the gallery and the aisles and stood 3 deep along the back wall and spilled out onto the steps where they stood in the October morning and listened through the open windows. Caleb saw them as he came up the street and felt the weight of that kind of solidarity. The weight of people who have decided that something matters enough to show up for it without being asked twice. Harlan Cross sat at the front table with 2 attorneys from Austin, men in dark suits with the smooth, unhurried confidence of professionals who have never lost a case they considered important. They had documents stacked neatly before them and the organized calm of people who believe the outcome has already been determined and the proceeding is largely administrative. Caleb sat at the opposite table alone. Nora sat directly behind him in the first row of the gallery. He did not look back at her. He did not need to. He knew she was there the way you know certain things about the structure of the space around you. Not through active awareness, but through the deeper, quieter certainty of something that has become part of how you orient yourself. Judge Arthur Fenwick entered and the room rose and settled. He was a compact man in his late 60s with a face that had been weathered by decades of listening to people tell him their version of the truth and the permanent expression of someone who has become very good at the difference between those versions and the actual thing. He looked at the packed room without visible surprise. He said, "I see this matter has attracted some community interest." He said it dryly. Nobody laughed, but the room understood. Cross's attorney, the elder of the 2, was named Calder. He was precise and thorough, and he built his case the way a mason builds a wall, one carefully placed stone at a time, each one tested before the next was added. He presented the historical record of water flow through the Mason Creek watershed. He presented survey documents showing the downstream properties that had depended on that flow. He presented affidavits from 3 ranchers in the Southern Valley attesting to reduced water access since the dam's completion. He was good. Caleb sat and listened and acknowledged inwardly that the man was good. When Calder finished, Judge Fenwick turned to the defense table. He said, "Mr. Mason, you are representing yourself in this matter." Caleb said, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge said, "Proceed." Caleb stood. He had prepared for this the way he prepared for everything, by thinking about it alone at night until the essential thing became clear and the rest fell away. He was not a man of speeches. He had never been comfortable with his own voice in rooms where people were listening specifically to him. But he had something Calder did not have, which was the truth of what had actually happened. And he had learned from 38 years of living that the truth, spoken plainly without decoration, had a weight that decorated falsehood could not match. He said, "Your Honor, everything Mr. Calder told you is accurate in its facts and misleading in its meaning. The creek that runs through my property has been dry since April. There has been no downstream flow to protect because there has been no flow at all. The dam does not divert water that was reaching anyone. It captures water that was being lost to evaporation and ground absorption, water that no one was receiving and no one was benefiting from." He set Edgar Pruitt's measurements on the judge's bench. The documents were meticulous, dated, witnessed, and annotated in Pruitt's careful handwriting. He said, "These are measurements of downstream flow taken before and after the dam's completion. Mr. Pruitt measured the flow at 3 points south of the structure during 2 separate rain events this month. In both cases, downstream volume exceeded the historical average for comparable rainfall, because the dam's spillway releases water in a controlled manner rather than allowing it to flash and disappear into dry ground." He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "I want to say one more thing, Your Honor, which is not about water law. It is about what actually happened here. Harlan Cross has been buying failing ranches in this valley for 5 years. He has been waiting for the drought to finish what it started and then acquiring the land for a fraction of its value. This dam threatens that plan because if the valley has reliable water, the valley survives. And if the valley survives, he cannot buy it cheaply." Calder was on his feet immediately. He said, "Your Honor, this is inflammatory and irrelevant." Judge Fennick said, "Sit down, Mr. Calder." He looked at Caleb. "Mr. Mason, confine yourself to the matter before the court." Caleb said, "Yes, Your Honor." He sat down. He had said what needed saying. The room had heard it. Nora was called as a witness. She walked to the chair with the same unhurried steadiness she brought to everything, her burned hand still bandaged at the palm, her dress plain and her posture the kind that cannot be taught because it comes from something interior rather than exterior, from a person who knows exactly who she is and has stopped apologizing for it. She stated her name. She stated her occupation. She stated how long she had been at the Mason Ranch. Calder rose for cross-examination and said, "Miss Elliot, you have no formal engineering credentials, no legal standing in this valley, no long-term connection to this community. On what basis do you offer testimony about complex matters of water management and property law?" Nora looked at him with the expression she reserved for questions that were trying to be something other than what they appeared to be. She said, "I offer testimony about what I observed and what I measured. My father was a civil engineer who taught me to read land and water from the time I could walk. I have been measuring the creek bed, the soil composition, the spillway output, and the downstream flow at the Mason Ranch for 6 weeks. I have written records of every measurement I took, witnessed by Mr. Pruitt, dated, and available for examination." She paused. She said, "As for my standing in this valley, I helped build that dam alongside 30 other people. One of them broke his leg doing it. All of them chose to be there knowing Harlan Cross had the resources to make their lives difficult afterward. I would suggest that constitutes a form of standing that your documents cannot fully capture." Calder said, "I have no further questions." He sat down with the contained expression of a man who has decided to cut his losses. Then Cormac Belleau stood up from the gallery without being called. He was not a man who made speeches. He was not a man who sought attention. He stood with his hat in both hands and waited until the judge acknowledged him with a nod. And then he said the only thing he had come to say. He said, "I have been building stone structures in Louisiana and Texas for 26 years. I built the Mason Dam. I designed the spillway to pass water downstream at a controlled rate, because that is what good engineering requires, and because the people who built it with me are not thieves. They are people trying to survive in hard country." He held up a folded piece of paper. He said, "I measured the water coming through the spillway at 6-hour intervals for the past 3 days. The average daily volume passing downstream is greater than the average daily volume that passed through the dry creek bed during the last rainfall event before the dam was built. More water is reaching Cross's land now than was reaching it before we built anything." He set the paper on the judge's bench. He said, "That is all I have to say." He sat back down. The room was very quiet. Judge Fenwick looked at Cormac's measurements. He looked at Pruitt's measurements. He looked at Calder's documents. He removed his spectacles and cleaned them with his handkerchief and replaced them and looked at everything again. He said, "I am going to take a brief recess." He was gone for 11 minutes. When he returned, the room rose and settled and went completely still. He said, "The evidence in this matter does not support the plaintiff's claim that the Mason Dam constitutes illegal diversion of water resources. The downstream flow data submitted by the defense demonstrates conclusively that water access to Southern Valley properties has not been reduced, and has in several measurements been improved by the structure's controlled release mechanism." He looked at Cross directly. He said, "I will add that the court takes a dim view of property disputes that appear designed to undermine legitimate community efforts at resource management during conditions of extreme hardship. The petition is denied. The Mason Dam and the cooperative structure governing its use are recognized as lawful. This court is adjourned." The room did not explode immediately. There was a single beat of absolute silence, the kind that comes when something that has been held in suspension for a very long time finally resolves. And then the sound came, not quite a cheer, something more complex than a cheer. The sound of people exhaling something they had been holding in their lungs for months. Caleb sat at his table and did not move for a moment. He looked at the papers in front of him. He looked at his hands. He turned around. Nora was looking at him from the first row with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not the careful steadiness she wore for difficult things, not the focused precision she wore for work, but something open and unguarded that had no practical purpose, that existed only because it could not help existing. He held that for a moment. Then the people around him began moving and talking, and the moment passed into something else. Outside the courthouse, the October sun was bright and the air had changed in the night, cooler and carrying a weight that people who live close to the land learn to read. Cross was waiting on the steps, not with his attorneys, not with any of the people who had been in the room with him. Alone, standing to one side of the steps with his hat in his hand and the look of a man who has spent the morning watching something he built in his mind come apart, and is still deciding what to do with that. He waited until Caleb reached the bottom of the steps. He said, "A moment." Caleb stopped. The two men stood in the October light and looked at each other with the directness of people who are past the stage of pretending. Cross said, "I have been in this valley for 30 years. I came here with a borrowed horse and $40, and I built something from nothing, which I am not ashamed of." He said it without boast, as a statement of fact. He said, "Somewhere in those 30 years, I stopped thinking of the people around me as neighbors and started thinking of them as variables, things that could be acquired or managed or waited out." He stopped. He said, "I do not entirely know when that happened." Caleb said nothing. Cross looked past him to where Nora stood with Pruitt and the Raffertys at the bottom of the steps, listening to something Pruitt was saying with her hand resting on young Clement Rafferty's shoulder. He said, "Do not wait as long as I did to say what needs saying. That is all." He put his hat back on. He said, "I will send the papers for the well access to Pruitt's office by end of week. No conditions attached." He walked to his horse. He mounted. He rode south. Caleb watched him go and felt the complexity of a man who has defeated someone and finds that the victory contains more sadness than he expected, because the person he defeated had once been someone worth being, and somewhere along the way had lost track of that, and the loss of it was not a small thing. 3 days after the verdict, a sealed envelope arrived at Pruitt's store, addressed to the Mason Creek Water Cooperative. Inside were the well-access documents, notarized and signed. No letter, no explanation, just the papers, properly executed as promised. Pruitt sent word to Caleb. Caleb read the documents twice and filed them in the cooperative ledger without comment. He did not know what to make of Harlan Cross. He suspected that was exactly how Cross preferred it. He felt a hand beside his, not taking his hand, just there, beside it, close enough to feel the warmth. He looked down. He looked at Nora. She was watching Cross ride away with the expression she wore when she was understanding something fully rather than partially. Then she turned and looked at Caleb with the directness that had been the first thing he noticed about her on a train platform in September, the look of someone who sees what is actually there rather than what is convenient to see. She said, "He was right, you know, about not waiting." He said, "I know." She said, "I am not going to pretend I do not know what you want to say. You have been saying it for weeks without saying it." He looked at her. He said, "Have I been that obvious?" She said, "Only to someone who was paying attention." The street around them was full of people talking and moving, the general warm commotion of a community that has won something together and is not quite ready to stop being together yet. Nobody was watching them specifically. They were simply two people standing at the edge of a crowd in the October sunshine. He said, "I cannot offer you certainty. The ranch is still in debt. The drought may return. The cooperative is new and untested over a long season." She said, "Caleb." He stopped. She said, "I left Philadelphia with a trunk of books and a ticket to a life that turned out not to exist. I sat on a platform for 3 days with nowhere to go. And then a man I had never met offered me a roof and honest work and his word that I would be treated with respect. And it turned out to be the truest offer anyone had ever made me." She said, "I know what uncertainty looks like. I know what it costs. I am not asking you for certainty. I am asking you for tomorrow, and the day after that. That is all." He reached out and took her hand. Not the burned one, the other one. He said, "Then yes, if you will have me." She said, "I have been waiting for you to catch up." He laughed. It came out of him unexpectedly, genuine, and a little rusty from disuse. And she looked up at him with something that was the closest thing to pure happiness he had seen on her face in all the weeks he had known her. He held her hand in the October sunshine outside the courthouse in Redemption, Texas, and did not let go for a long time. That night, alone in his room, Caleb opened Ruth's letter. He sat at the small table by the window with the lamp burning low, and the letter unfolded in front of him and read it for the first time. Ruth had known when she wrote it that she might not come through. She had known the way people sometimes know things they do not say aloud, because saying them makes the shape of them too real. She had written the letter in the last week in the handwriting that was smaller and more careful than her usual hand, the handwriting of someone conserving energy. She had written about Clara first, about how Clara had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and would grow up to be someone extraordinary if she was given the chance. She had written about the ranch, about how much she loved it, about the view from the hill in the evenings, about the particular light in October. Then she had written about him. She had written, "Caleb, you are the best man I have ever known, and also the most stubborn. And those two things are connected in ways I have always found equal parts maddening and wonderful. You will want to stop after this. I know you. You will want to close up the house and close up your heart and keep going through the motions of living without actually living, because that feels safer than opening yourself to loss again." She had written, "I am asking you not to do that, not for my sake, for yours, because you are too good a man to spend the rest of your life being only half present in it." She had written, "When you are ready, and I trust that you will know when you are ready, let yourself be found by whoever is waiting to find you." She had signed it simply, "Always, Ruth." He sat with the letter for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the wooden box that held the small brown shoes, and he closed the box, and he put the box on the shelf where the shoes had once sat alone. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about Ruth, who had known him well enough to write that letter, and about Clara, who had her father's eyes, and about a train platform in September, and a woman in a gray dress who had been waiting for a life that had not arrived and had built a different one instead. He did not feel the weight lift. Grief does not lift, but it shifted the way a stone shifts when water moves around it long enough. Not gone, but changed in its relationship to everything else, part of the structure now rather than the obstacle. He was asleep before midnight for the first time in 2 years. They were married on the last Sunday of October beside the reservoir. The water was there. 3 weeks of October rain had filled the basin behind the dam to a level that Nora had calculated as sufficient for the valley through a winter and into spring, even with no additional rainfall. She had shown Caleb the numbers, and he had looked at them and said, "You were right." She had said, "The geometry was right." He had said, "You saw the geometry." She had not argued the point because she was right and they both knew it, and some things do not require further discussion. The ceremony was simple. Edgar Pruitt had been appointed Justice of the Peace by the county the previous month, and he performed the service in his good coat with his spectacles on and his ledger nowhere in evidence, because this was not a transaction. It was a sacrament, and he understood the difference. 140 people came. The Rafferty family came. Owen on a crutch with his leg healing cleanly, as Nora had said it would. Clement in a shirt that was too big for him because he had borrowed it from his oldest brother and considered this an appropriate sacrifice for the occasion. Cormac Belleau came in a coat Caleb had never seen before and stood at the back with his hat held correctly and watched the proceedings with the expression of a man who has built something that will outlast him and knows it. Harlan Cross did not come to the ceremony, but the morning of the wedding, Caleb found a package on the porch when he went out at dawn. Inside was a bottle of good whiskey and a folded note in Cross's handwriting that said only, "For the cold nights ahead." Caleb put the bottle on the shelf in the kitchen and did not say anything about it to anyone, but he did not throw it away. They stood beside the water that they had fought for and built for and nearly lost, in the October light that was doing what October light in Texas does, which is to make everything look like it was worth the trouble. And Edgar Pruitt read the words that joined them, and they said what needed to be said, and then they were married. Caleb kissed his wife in front of 140 people and felt the completeness of it, not the absence of loss. Loss does not become absence, but the addition of something new alongside it. Something living and present and oriented toward the future rather than away from the past. Nora pressed her forehead briefly against his shoulder before she stepped back. A private thing, brief enough that most people missed it. He did not miss it. The celebration lasted until dark. In April, when the valley had gone green in a way that people who had seen the drought found almost impossible to credit, Nora gave birth to a son. It was a long labor, as first labors often are, and the morning after was cold, and the lamp was burning, and the room smelled of wood smoke and the intimacy of hard things that have been survived. Mrs. Rafferty had attended, and Dr. Hale from town, and when it was finished and the room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet after the essential work is done, Dr. Hale placed a bundle in Caleb's arms and said, "A boy, Mr. Mason. Healthy, good, strong lungs." Caleb held his son. He stood beside the bed where Nora lay with her eyes open and tired and looking at him with the expression she had worn on the dam site when the last stone was set. That complex and earned and fully present quality of someone who has done a hard thing well and is allowing themselves to know it. She said, "Well." He said, "Well." She said, "What will we call him?" He looked at the child. The child had dark hair like his mother and was currently expressing strong opinions about the world with considerable volume. He was very small. He was the most real thing Caleb had held in his hands in years. He said, James Ruth Mason." Nora was quiet for a moment. She said, "Ruth?" He said, "She would have liked you." She was practical, and she did not waste words. And she always saw what was actually in front of her, rather than what she wished was there. He looked up from the baby to Nora. "You remind me of her in that way." Nora looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I am glad she wrote that letter." He said, "So am I." He sat down on the edge of the bed and she leaned against his shoulder, and James Ruth Mason continued to express his opinions about existence with great conviction. And outside the window, the April morning was coming up gold over the eastern hills, the same hills that had been brown and dead 6 months ago, and were now covered in the vivid green of land that has been given water after a long drought, the extravagant, urgent green of things that are growing fast because they know from experience that the good conditions do not always last, and the time to grow is now. He carried James to the dam that morning while Nora slept. It was not yet 6 o'clock, and the air was cool, and the valley spread below in the early light with the dreamlike quality of things seen before they have been fully woken into their ordinary daytime selves. The reservoir behind the dam caught the sky and held it, a sheet of pale blue water where 6 months ago there had been only dust and the memory of water. He stood on the crest of the dam and held his son against his chest and looked out at the valley that was alive again. He thought about his father, who had built this ranch from the ground when the valley was young and had believed in permanence as a form of faith. He thought about Ruth, who had loved this land and seen in it not what it was, but what it could be, and who had written him a letter that had taken him 2 years to read and had said exactly what he needed to hear. He thought about a September afternoon and a train platform and a woman in a gray dress who had been waiting for a life that had not arrived, who had looked at his dying ranch and seen something worth saving, who had run toward a burning fuse in the dark without calculating the cost first, because some things are worth the risk. He looked down at James, who had fallen asleep against his chest with the complete and trusting unconsciousness of the very new. The unconsciousness of someone who has not yet learned that the world is sometimes difficult, and is for now simply warm and held and safe. He said quietly, to no one in particular and to everyone who was listening in whatever way the dead listen, which is fully and without judgment, this is what you built, both of you. This is what it became. The sun cleared the eastern hills. The light came across the water and across the green valley and across the stone face of the dam that 31 people had built in a single day, because they had decided that some things were worth building even when the outcome was uncertain and the cost was real and the opposition was powerful, and the easy choice was always to give up and walk away. Behind him, from the direction of the ranch house, he heard the back door open. He heard her footsteps on the porch, and then in the yard, and then coming up the gentle rise toward the dam, unhurried, the footsteps of someone who knows where she is going and is not in a hurry, because she has already arrived at the place she was always supposed to be. She came and stood beside him. She looked at the water. She looked at the valley. She looked at James sleeping against his father's chest in the April morning. She said, "He is going to want to learn how it works, you know, when he is old enough." Caleb said, "We will show him." She slipped her hand into his. They stood together on the crest of the dam they had built and looked out at the valley that had survived, and the water held steady behind the stone, patient and full, waiting to be useful, which is the best that any held thing can be. He had started by building a dam to hold the water in. But what the water kept was never only water. It was the proof that two broken people, given enough time and enough honest work and enough willingness to stay, could build something that would outlast the worst that the land and the grief and the fear had to offer. It was the proof that second chances are not given. They are built, stone by stone, day by day, by people who have decided that the future is worth more than the safety of staying still. The April morning opened around them, gold and green and wide, the way mornings do in a valley that has come back to life. And they stayed.